The morning mist hung heavy over the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944, masking the horizon in a deceptive calm. Sailors aboard the small escort carriers and destroyers of the task unit known as Taffy Three went about their morning routines, expecting another day of submarine patrols and ground support. They were positioned off the island of Samar to protect the vulnerable transport ships, unloading troops and supplies on the beaches of Leyte. The men drank their coffee and watched the sunrise, unaware that just over the curvature of the earth, the largest surface fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever assembled was steaming directly toward them at high speed. The silence of the ocean was about to be shattered by the thunder of history. Without warning, the calm water erupted into massive geysers of white foam and deadly steel as heavy-caliber shells began to rain down around the fragile American ships. The crew members looked to the north and saw a sight that froze the blood in their veins. Emerging from the San Bernardino Strait was the Japanese center force, a terrifying armada of battleships and cruisers, led by the colossal super battleship Yamato. The Japanese fleet had slipped through the American defenses unnoticed and now found themselves perfectly positioned to annihilate the landing forces at Leyte Gulf. The sailors of Taffy Three realized with horror that they were the only thing standing between the enemy and thousands of defenseless troops. The situation was catastrophic because Taffy Three was never designed for surface combat against capital ships. The unit consisted of slow escort carriers known as baby flat tops, which were converted merchant hulls with thin steel plating and no heavy armor. Protecting them were 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, which the sailors affectionately called tin cans because they lacked significant protection against enemy fire. These ships carried only 5-inch guns and torpedoes, which were pitifully inadequate against the thick armor belts of the Japanese battleships. The disparity in firepower was so immense that a single hit from a Japanese main gun could tear an American destroyer in half. Panic could have easily consumed the American formation as the massive shells screamed overhead, sounding like freight trains tearing through the sky. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander of Taffy Three, immediately ordered his carriers to turn east into the wind to launch their aircraft and make smoke to hide their escape. He knew his slow ships could not outrun the Japanese cruisers that were closing the distance rapidly. Sprague broadcast an urgent plea for help in plain language, hoping that Admiral William Halsey and his powerful Third Fleet were nearby. However, Halsey had been lured away to the north, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Taffy Three was alone and facing certain destruction. Amidst this chaos and impending doom, one man decided that flight was not an option. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans was the commanding officer of the United States ship Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer positioned on the outer screen of the formation. Evans was a man of intense pride and warrior spirit, born in Oklahoma with Cherokee and Creek ancestry. Before the battle, he had told his crew that he would never retreat from a fight regardless of the odds. As the Japanese fleet loomed large on the horizon, Evans did not wait for orders from his superiors. He made a decision that would become the stuff of naval legend and define the spirit of the United States Navy. Evans ordered the Johnston to turn directly toward the overwhelming enemy force and increase speed to flank speed. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, pushing the destroyer to over 30 knots as it charged alone against the entire Japanese center force. It was a maneuver that seemed suicidal to anyone watching, but Evans knew that he had to disrupt the Japanese aim to buy time for the carriers to escape. The Johnston began to weave through the water, laying a thick screen of black smoke and white chemical fog. The small destroyer looked like a toy boat charging into the jaws of a leviathan, but its crew manned their battle stations with grim determination. As the Johnston closed the distance, the Japanese gunners struggled to track the small and agile target moving through the smoke. Evans waited until he was within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano, which was the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division. The American 5-inch guns barked rapidly, firing hundreds of rounds that smashed into the superstructure of the Japanese ship. The shells could not penetrate the heavy hull armor, but they started fires and wreaked havoc on the bridge and decks. The Japanese returned fire, filling the air with colorful splashes of dyed water used to spot their shell falls, but the Johnston continued its relentless charge. When the range closed to within torpedo distance, Evans gave the order to fire his full spread of 10 torpedoes. The underwater missiles raced toward the Yamato, as the Johnston turned hard to retreat behind its own smoke screen. Moments later, a massive underwater explosion rocked the Japanese cruiser, blowing off its bow and taking it out of the fight. The audacious attack had drawn first blood and forced the Japanese formation to take evasive action, disrupting their pursuit of the carriers. However, the Johnston did not escape unscathed, as 3 heavy shells from a battleship slammed into its aft section, tearing through the engineering spaces and cutting its speed in half. The damage to the Johnston was severe, with dead and wounded sailors scattered across the decks and vital machinery destroyed. Evans himself was wounded by shrapnel that shredded his shirt and left him bleeding, but he refused to leave the bridge. With the steering engine disabled, the ship had to be steered manually from the rear steering compartment, while Evans shouted orders down an open hatch. Despite the carnage and the loss of speed, Evans saw that the Japanese were still closing in on the defenseless carriers. He looked at his battered crew and ordered the ship to turn back toward the enemy for a second attack. The bravery of the Johnston inspired the other destroyers in the screen to join the fray. The United States ship, hull captained by Commander Leon Kimperger, launched its own attack against the Japanese battleships. The hull was hit repeatedly by heavy caliber shells that knocked out its engines and guns, but the crew fought on until the ship began to sink. The United States ship Heermann also charged into the mix, engaging heavy cruisers and even challenging the battleship Haruna. These small ships wove in and out of the smoke, firing their guns until the barrels were white hot, creating a chaotic melee that confused the Japanese commanders. Even the smaller destroyer escorts, which were slower and less heavily armed than the destroyers, joined the desperate defense. The United States ship Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, charged toward the heavy cruiser Chaka. Copeland had told his crew over the loudspeaker that they were entering a fight from which they could not expect to survive, but they would do maximum damage before they went down. The Samuel B. Roberts fired its guns so rapidly that it exhausted almost its entire supply of ammunition, setting the Japanese cruiser ablaze before eventually being silenced by massive return fire. While the destroyers and destroyer escorts sacrificed themselves on the surface, the pilots from the escort carriers launched a relentless aerial assault. The planes were armed with whatever munitions were available, including depth charges meant for submarines and small anti-personnel bombs. Some pilots flew with no ammunition at all, making dry runs at the Japanese ships to distract the gunners and force them to turn. The air was filled with desperate dogfights and flak as the American aviators buzzed the bridges of the Japanese battleships, firing their revolvers out of their cockpit windows in a display of sheer defiance. The Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita, was bewildered by the ferocity of the American defense. The smoke screens and the aggressive attacks by the destroyers led him to believe he was facing a much larger force of fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. The constant air attacks and the loss of several of his cruisers added to the confusion on the Japanese bridge. Kurita could not see the escort carriers clearly through the squalls and smoke, and he began to worry that American reinforcements were closing in to trap him. The tactical picture was falling apart despite his overwhelming advantage in firepower. On the deck of the Johnston, Lieutenant Commander Evans continued to fight despite the ship being a wreck. The bridge was smashed, and Evans was forced to command from the fantail, shouting orders to the men manually turning the rudder. The destroyer was now surrounded by Japanese ships firing at point-blank range. The Japanese destroyers began to circle the wounded Johnston, pouring fire into its hull. Evans ordered his gunners to fire at the enemy destroyers, forcing them to keep their distance even as the Johnston began to settle lower in the water. The ship had no torpedoes left and its engines were failing, but it refused to die. The end for the Johnston came when the Japanese destroyers closed in for the kill, firing a final spread of torpedoes and shelling the waterline. With all power lost and the ship taking on massive amounts of water, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. As the survivors scrambled into the oil-slicked water, they witnessed a surreal sight. The captain of a passing Japanese destroyer was seen standing on his bridge, saluting the sinking Johnston as it slipped beneath the waves. It was a rare gesture of respect from an enemy who recognized the extraordinary courage of the American crew. Back in the main formation, the escort carrier Gambier Bay was taking heavy fire from the Japanese cruisers. Without the speed to escape, the carrier was bracketed by shell splashes that grew closer with every salvo. A massive shell penetrated the engine room, flooding the boiler and leaving the ship dead in the water. The Japanese closed in and pummeled the helpless carrier until it capsized and sank, taking many of its crew with it. It was the only American aircraft carrier of the war to be sunk by surface naval gunfire. The situation seemed hopeless for the remaining ships of Taffy Three. Just as the Japanese fleet seemed poised to wipe out the remaining American ships, a miracle occurred. Admiral Kurita, believing he had inflicted heavy damage on a strong American force and fearing air attacks from the Third Fleet, ordered his ships to break off the engagement and retreat to the north. The sailors on the American ships could not believe their eyes as the massive battleships and cruisers turned away and faded into the mist. The Japanese had been on the verge of a total victory that would have devastated the Leyte landings, but they had been bluffed into retreat. The withdrawal of the Japanese center force left the survivors of Taffy Three stunned and relieved, but the danger was not entirely over. As the surface ships retreated, the first organized kamikaze attacks of the war struck the remaining escort carriers. The United States ship St. Lo was hit by a Japanese Zero that crashed through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, causing the ship to sink rapidly. The exhausted crews had to fight fires and rescue their shipmates while processing the trauma of the morning. The battle had lasted only a few hours, but the cost was devastating. In the water, the survivors of the sunken ships faced a new ordeal. Hundreds of men from the Johnston, the Hull, the Samuel B. Roberts, and the Gambier Bay drifted in the ocean waiting for rescue. Due to communications errors and the confusion of battle, rescue ships did not arrive for several days. The men clung to life rafts in debris, battling exposure, thirst, and the terrifying presence of sharks. Many sailors who had survived the battle succumbed to their injuries or the elements while waiting for help to arrive. It was a tragic postscript to their heroic stand. The rescue ships finally arrived to pull the oil-soaked survivors from the sea. The stories of heroism began to circulate as the men were brought aboard the recovery vessels. The magnitude of what they had accomplished began to sink in. A handful of destroyers and slow carriers had turned back the pride of the Japanese Navy. The battle off Samar would go down in history as one of the greatest upsets in naval warfare. The strategic victory secured the beachhead at Leyte and allowed the liberation of the Philippines to continue without the threat of Japanese naval intervention. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans was not among the survivors found by the rescue ships. He was last seen on the fantail of the Johnston, ensuring his men got off the ship safely. For his incredible leadership and self-sacrifice, Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation read that he fought his ship with the most gallant and intrepid spirit. He became the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest military honor, and a frigate was later named in his memory. The Battle of Samar is often compared to the biblical story of David and Goliath, but even that comparison fails to capture the disparity in power. The Japanese fleet outweighed the Americans by a factor of 10 to 1 in tonnage and possessed guns that could fire shells weighing as much as an American car. Yet the psychological impact of the aggressive American counterattack broke the will of the Japanese command. It proved that in warfare, morale and determination can sometimes overcome superior technology and numbers. The decision by Admiral Halsey to take the Third Fleet north chasing a decoy force remains one of the most controversial decisions of World War II. It left the San Bernardino Strait wide open and exposed Taffy Three to destruction. Halsey was criticized for falling into the Japanese trap, but the bravery of the tin-can sailors prevented his mistake from becoming a strategic disaster. The men of Taffy Three had covered the flank of the entire invasion force with nothing but their lives and their courage. Historians continue to study the battle as a prime example of the fog of war. Admiral Kurita's failure to press his advantage saved thousands of American lives, but his caution was understandable given the ferocity of the resistance he faced. The Japanese intercepted radio traffic suggesting American help was minutes away, when in reality it was hours away. The deception created by the smoke and the aggressive tactics of Evans and his fellow captains created an illusion of strength that altered the course of the war in the Pacific. The legacy of the Johnston and the other ships of Taffy Three lives on in the United States Navy. The battle demonstrated the vital importance of the destroyer Escort and the fighting spirit of the American sailor. Monuments and memorials now stand to honor the men who fought off Samar, ensuring that their sacrifice is never forgotten. The story serves as a timeless reminder that duty and courage can shine brightest in the darkest of hours when all hope seems lost. Today, the wreck of the Johnston lies deeper than the Titanic resting on the floor of the Philippine Sea. It was discovered recently by deep-sea explorers, its hull still bearing the scars of the massive shells that brought it down. The discovery brought closure to the families of the lost sailors and reignited interest in this incredible chapter of history. The silent steel grave serves as a permanent testament to the men who charged into the valley of death without hesitation. The survivors of Taffy Three gathered for reunions for decades after the war, sharing their stories and honoring their fallen shipmates. They called themselves the Tin Can Sailors, a name worn with immense pride. They were ordinary men from farms and cities across America who were thrust into an extraordinary situation. They did not consider themselves heroes, but simply men who did their job when their country needed them most. Their humility only adds to the magnitude of their achievement. The tactical lessons of Samar are still taught at naval academies around the world. The battle illustrates the effectiveness of aggressive maneuvering and the use of smoke and terrain even at sea. It also highlights the importance of initiative among junior officers like Evans, who did not wait for orders to attack. The independent actions of the destroyer captains created a coordinated chaos that the rigid Japanese command structure could not handle. As we look back on the events of October 1944, we are reminded of the high price of freedom. The waters off Samar are calm now, but they hold the spirits of brave men who gave everything for their brothers in arms. The image of the tiny Johnston charging the massive Yamato is an enduring symbol of American resolve. It challenges us to ask ourselves if we would have the same courage to stand firm against insurmountable odds. In the annals of military history, few battles demonstrate the power of the human spirit as clearly as the battle off Samar. It was a fight that should have been lost on paper, but was won in the hearts of the sailors. The undying legacy of Taffy Three is a beacon of inspiration, proving that victory is not always determined by the size of the gun, but by the courage of the one who fires it. The whisper of time carries their story forward, ensuring that the world remembers the day the Tin Cans fought the giants. The sheer audacity of the American attack created a psychological impact that rippled through the Japanese fleet. Japanese officers later admitted in interrogations that they were convinced they were fighting a much superior force. They could not conceive that a handful of destroyers would attack a battleship formation so recklessly unless they were supported by heavy capital ships just out of sight. This miscalculation, born of the American refusal to yield, was the pivot point upon which the entire battle turned. The role of the aircraft from the escort carriers cannot be overstated in the final analysis of the battle. These pilots flew obsolete aircraft against superior Japanese Zeros and intense anti-aircraft fire. They formed a relentless swarm that pecked away at the Japanese giants, blinding their optical rangefinders and forcing them to constantly turn to avoid torpedoes and bombs. This constant maneuvering prevented the Japanese battleships from bringing their main batteries to bear effectively on the slow-moving carriers. Among the many heroes of the day, the name of Ernest Evans stands tall as a paragon of naval leadership. His distinct voice, calm and commanding over the sound, powered phones held his crew together as their world disintegrated around them. He fought not for glory, but for the survival of the men in the transport ships behind him. His example set a standard for combat leadership that is cited in military training to this day. The Battle of Samar effectively ended the Japanese Navy capacity to wage large-scale offensive operations. The loss of cruisers and the failure to stop the Leyte landings meant that the Philippines would be retaken by Allied forces. This severed the Japanese supply lines to the oil-rich East Indies and starved the Japanese war machine of fuel. The brave stand of Taffy Three hastened the end of the war and saved countless lives in the long run. As the sun set on that fateful day in October 1944, the sea was littered with oil and debris, but the American flag still flew over Leyte Gulf. The gamble of the Japanese High Command had failed, and the resolve of the United States Navy had held firm. The survivors of Taffy Three, though battered and grieving, knew they had participated in something miraculous. They had looked into the face of annihilation and forced it to blink.